Hi students, and welcome to this lecture on the ancient world of art. So we're going to start here, and this won't cover everything. There's a lot of other things that are covered in the supplemental material for this week, but I'm just going to go over a few key things in this mini lecture. And I would like to start here because it's an interesting, yes, you guessed it, contemporary space. It's not ancient, but it has much to do with an ancient space that comes up often in art history textbooks. So this is actually the contemporary building where you can find replicas of the cave paintings from Lascaux in France. Now, these paintings come up all the time when you talk about ancient cave paintings. We're going to look at some that are close to those paintings today. But because they used to be open to the public, and anytime you think of ancient cave paintings, if you Google it, you'll probably get images from Lascaux. These are from 25,000 years before the Common Era. So today we live in the Common Era, so 2,000 years plus the Common Era. And anything that is BCE, or before the Common Era, that means that many years before year zero. And of course, now we're in year 2000 and so forth. So these are from 25,000 years before the Common Era. And people used to be able to go and tour them, but now because that actually destroyed this, no, it didn't destroy the space, but it made it so that it was difficult to preserve those. And so they had to close that space down. And what they did, though, was create a replica. And so you can go to this very modern, very contemporary building today, close to the site, and actually experience ancient cave paintings replicated. Very, very closely though, so you can almost experience the real things, and then, you know, that they're kept preserved for future generations as well. So I wanted to bring that up to bring it to the present in some ways. Here's some learning objectives, things we're going to go over. Describe some of the ways in which prehistoric people and prehistoric art reflects the social aspirations of early peoples. Discuss the ways in which history is made and knowledge is produced and changes over time, because it is, of course, understood that anything, especially from ancient history, is knowledge that is not just found, but rather produced, and typically by white men. And so we'll see that it basically comes from Western Europe, and we'll see how their theories have changed over time, and so history tends to change, right? And then we'll discuss cultural heritage and the fight contemporarily to the fight for the return of certain objects that were stolen. We call this restitution, and this will lead to a different project in the course that you'll see in the coming weeks. That's called the mock trial about restitution. But before we get there, and I know it seems odd, I'm showing you another contemporary building when I'm talking about ancient art, but I do want to bring up this contemporary building. And if I had you in class today, I would ask you, do you know what this is? And all of you would say, no, what is that? Which is totally fine. This is the Waste Isolation Pilot Plant. It's in New Mexico in the middle of the desert. The reason that it's in the middle of the desert is because it holds 850,000 barrels of nuclear waste, radioactive material, and this is in a chamber that's 2 miles underground, underneath this site. It was opened in 1999. It's set to close in 2030, so not too far off. And the reason why we're talking about it today is because there was recently a panel of experts who got together to try to think about how to create a marker, a permanent marker, a symbol that basically will tell future peoples that this is a dangerous site. And you're probably wondering, well, can't you just put a danger sign up? Can't you just put, you know, something that says danger, radioactive material? Well, if it were only that easy. The thing about language and symbols is that they change over time. And this is part of my point with this ancient art lecture, is that a lot of these materials in this chamber, 2 miles underground, will be active, radioactive, and toxic, you know, for millions of years. And so we already know that symbols have changed as much as early as 500 years ago. Symbols looked different. And so we'll look at a few of those. We'll look at specific paintings to think about that in just a little bit. But the reason why this is important is because artists are now thinking, okay, 2 million years from now, when these are still active, will we have the same language? Will we have the same symbols? Will danger still mean danger? We just don't know. So they're looking to designers, art historians, architects, historians, linguists, people who study the history of imagery and the history of language and how it changes over time, to think about a timeless, universal, basically symbol of danger. So they've come up with a variety of things. Spikes, right? Here's one of the concepts that came out of that meeting. A spike field. Spikes are dangerous, right? You touch one and it hurts. So, here's some ideas that will just, no matter what, even if we don't have the same language or symbols, spikes mean danger. So here's a giant spike field that they are thinking about putting over the site. It's in the middle of the New Mexico desert. It gets really hot there. So how about a bunch of, like a huge miles of these dark black plates, stone that heats up in the middle of the desert so that it's too hot, so that it still even radiates heat, so that no one will go by, because hot means danger, right? It's always going to mean danger. So these are some of the ideas that came up for these theorists. Well, the reason I'm bringing this up is because let's think about today's danger signs, right? I just did a quick Google search and I put in danger and look what I found. This is what you get. And if I was in class, I'd ask you, what do you think, what kinds of signs do you associate with danger? And you might say these things, right? Maybe red and black, the word danger, radioactive material sign, exclamation points, skulls, right? But it's important to note that even 500 years ago, 600 years ago, skulls have meant a variety of different things. So this is a symbol and a language that's changed. If we look to Fra Angelico, an Italian artist working in the 1400s with this image of the crucifix, and really, if you look at many images of the crucifix coming out at this time, you'll see a skull at the base of Christ and his blood dripping onto the top of the skull. And here it does not have anything to do with danger. Rather, it has something to do with original sin and redemption. People who study religious imagery would say that the skull here has much to do with the idea of Christ's blood dripping over kind of the original sin of Adam. And so the skull actually represents Adam. And so you'd say that it has to do with cleansing of the original sins. Okay. Now, not even 100 years later, this is still not that long ago, we've got another artist who's portraying the skull in a different way for a different reason. Hans Holbein the Younger, in his painting, The Ambassadors. And I'm not going to get into this painting. We will probably talk about it later in the course. It's really awesome and really important and full of symbolism. But what I want you to look at is this smudge in the front. Now, if you take a look, if you go to the side of your computer and down a little bit, and you look up at that smudge, you'll see it looks like a skull. That's because this painting was supposed to be placed up in next to a stairway, so that anyone who climbed the stairway would see the skull first because of their vantage point, and then see the two men. So here, the skull is actually a symbol of, understanding that you will die. This is what we call a memento mori, a very common symbol used specifically to remind people at this time in history, and people still use it today, to remind people that, nobody lives forever, that we all will die. So not to get attached to earthly things, because all of those things are temporary. And so here you have yet another meaning behind the skull. So how are we supposed to know what ancient people's paintings meant when these were 25,000 years ago? We have no idea what these people were interested in. We have no idea why they made these ancient paintings, yet we try to theorize, right? And I'm glad that we do. But it's important to note, and that's why I bring up all of this change in imagery over time, and this specific case of artists and historians and linguists trying to figure out, well, how do we create a universal symbol that will persevere, a timeless symbol? which, you know, technically this stuff's going to be around for millions of years. We look 500 years back and the skull is a different symbol. It doesn't necessarily mean danger. So we can't just put a big old danger sign on the radioactive material. So the reason I like to bring this up, and hopefully it's all coming together for you, is because just like those people who are creating this symbol for this radioactive site cannot think about today's language as one that will exist in the same way a million years from now, we can't think of these handprints, these symbols, these spotted horses as having anything necessarily to do with what we today would, the meaning we would put on them today, because we literally have a very different language than they used to have, a very different set of symbols and values probably, all sorts of things. They lived very different lives. We have no idea what things were like at this time in history, yet we try to understand them. And so the reason I like to bring in the contemporary radioactive site is to think about, well, how can we really know anything at all? These people who are creating the radioactive symbol, they know nothing about the people are going to exist, you know, thousands of years from now, let alone millions. And so how can we know about these people and the symbols they produced? So that's the way I like to start with my ancient art lecture, is to really remind us that we don't know anything about these people, but we do theorize. And so it is important to note everything that comes up in this week's lecture, PowerPoints, readings, supplemental material is all theorized because we don't have written records from this time. We don't have a language from this time. We don't know anything, really, and we just take the objects that we find and then we place meaning on them. So really important to note, right? Of course, this is amazing, and these are covered in the PowerPoint. Look at the handprints, right? We have signatures here. We know that the artist was interested in using the rock formation. How amazing to create the horse's head. This must have been a type of spotted horse that is probably extinct. So it tells us something about, you know, the animals at the time, but we don't know why. You know, there's lots of different theories, and those will be outlined in your lecture in the other PowerPoint. But these are all theories because we just don't know. Okay. So I like to start there. And now I want to talk about some carved figurines. So small carved figurines of people and animals were commonly carved by early peoples. You can see they're very abstract. And we're going to specifically look at the woman of Willendorf, the one that I'm circling here. These could have served a variety of purposes, and art historians have long had theories about these objects because typically they are women, and typically they have accentuated features like the large breasts, large thighs, large midsections, and then really no emphasis on the head, or the head is missing completely. So it could be a guardian figure, but also historians have often talked about fertility as being tied to this because of the way that the figure seems so bountiful and so ready to birth. But again, we don't know. So let's focus on the Venus, well, I call her the Venus accidentally, which I'm about to critique. The woman of Willendorf, who you see here. The woman of Willendorf, I called her the Venus, and she's typed in as the Venus here partially because that used to be my training. When I was going to grad school, when I was an undergrad specifically, she used to be called the Venus, because that's what the person who found her in 1908 decided, that she was a Venus figure. She was found in 1908, even though she is from about 28,000 to 25,000 years before the Common Era, so she's super ancient. She's very tiny. You can see her right here. She would actually fit in the palm of my hand. She belonged to a nomadic community. That means a community that moved, that traveled, so you could easily put her in your pocket, in your bag, as you moved along in your travels. She now exists here in the Natural Museum, the Museum of Natural History in Vienna, and they've created a temple for her. This is where she's housed. Notice she's not in the art museum. She's in a natural history museum, because there tends to be kind of a weird debate within the history of art that has to do with artifacts like this, and objects that aren't, necessarily a painting or specifically a, Renaissance sculpture, something that might have had more utility to it. So you see that she's in the Natural History Museum, and they've created basically a temple, and on it says Venus von Willendorf, the Venus of Willendorf. And that is just because she was given that name in 1908. Now, if you think about the Venus, and many of you have probably seen images of Venus or taken classes on Greek or Roman mythology, and you might know that in Greek mythology, there is a Venus, right? She is the goddess of love. So when you think of the Venus, do you think of images like this? Maybe. Within the history of art, this is what we think of. This is The Birth of Venus by Sandro Botticelli, a cropped part of the painting. There she is. She is the goddess of love and beauty. You see her being born from the ocean, and she's blown in by the wind. And then you see another picture of her, the Venus de Milo from 101 before the Common Era, a little older. A Roman goddess, again, tied to love and beauty, the Venus of Urbino by Titian from 1500. Again, these are very Renaissance, very classical images of the Venus. So the guy who found her in 1908 had ideas in his head tied to the types of Venuses, right? So he sees this woman figure and just calls her a Venus figure, even though we have no idea if she's tied to the goddess of love, because we have no written record of her. We just have her found around a city called Willendorf in Vienna. So that's literally all we know about her. We can only theorize, okay? And so, of course, theories tied to fertility make sense. Tied to perhaps some sort of kind of religiosity makes sense. She could have a variety of different uses, but we just don't know. And it's likely that she was painted red. You can see some of the red ochre here left on her. But it's important to note that we place meaning on these objects, meaning that's actually not there, but meaning that we want to be there. So she's called Venus. She's placed in a temple, right? Like a Venus, like a god. And if you were to go to this place, there's a little button you can push and it plays flute music. We have no idea if ancient people in the city of Willendorf in Vienna even had flutes, right? We have no idea, but we're placing that on her. And anyone who comes to visit her would think of that as being tied to her, even though we have no idea. So it's important to understand, yes, she might have been tied to fertility. It's likely, look at her. She might be tied to early understandings of beauty in the female body and voluptuousness. However, we have no idea. So we have to keep these things in mind when we study ancient objects like her. Now, the one thing, and then of course, keep all of that in mind when you're thinking about the things coming up in your PowerPoint, which really does cover much more. The next thing and the last thing I want to talk about today is cultural heritage. Heritage is a property, something that's inherited, passed down from previous generations. In the case of cultural heritage, heritage doesn't have to consist of money or property, but could in this instance, and when we talk about art, consist of culture, values, or traditions. Cultural heritage can imply a shared bond, a belonging to a community, or something that represents our identity, our bond to the past, present, or future. So what can be a piece of cultural heritage as an object? Artifacts, paintings, drawings, prints, mosaics, sculptures. These are things we think about kind of traditionally, but also thinking about more broad human creativity, expression, photographs, documents, books, instruments, songs, manuscripts, and immaterial objects, traditions, oral histories, performing arts, social practices, traditional craftsmanship, relationships, representations, rituals, knowledge and skills. So why is this important? Well, there's an organization called UNESCO. You might have heard about it. It's called the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization. It was founded in the 1950s. It's an organization that's created to implement international conventions on the protection of cultural heritage. And so that also means cultural heritage sites. So places where ancient objects were found, ancient burials, ancient sites, stuff like that. So here's a map of cultural heritage sites, and you see many are in Western Europe, right? And in Mexico, there's a lot of them too, because we have a lot of ancient art in Mexico. So who owns cultural heritage, and how can it become blurred over time and space? Well, this brings me to thinking about the idea and the problem of restitution. Over time, people with more power have found it easy to take the cultural heritage, right, cultural property of less powerful people. Usually this means white European men taking things that aren't theirs. In a time when either no one was there to fight them, or people couldn't fight them because they weren't strong enough, or there weren't any laws against it, or something like that. Well, now they still have those objects. So restitution is the demand for the return of a work of art or cultural property acquired under disputable circumstances, often as spoils of war. So we go against each other in war, and I win, and I take all your awesome art, right? So this happened a lot back in the day. Currently, those stolen or taken spoils of war are housed in a lot of national museums and civic museums, mostly in the United States, of course, or Western Europe, of course. For instance, here's a stele of Naram Sin's super important art object from Iran, but today it's in the Louvre in Paris. Here's the Rosetta Stone, an amazing artifact from Egypt that basically allowed us to understand hieroglyphs in English and other languages, because it has three different languages, three of the same passages in three different languages on the stone. One is in hieroglyphs, one is in Greek, which was decipherable, and one was in a second type of hieroglyphs. Amazing object, belongs to the Egyptians. Wouldn't they love to have it in one of their museums? Well, it's in the British Museum because it was stolen way back. Here's the stele of Hammurabi. This is from Iran as well. Again, stolen at the time when people weren't able to protect it, taken to the Louvre in Paris, okay? There's loads of stuff like this. In 2003, there was more that happened. Iraq National Museum was looted because it was unguarded in 2003. A bunch of stuff was taken. The Warrock head that you see here, the Uruk carved vessel that you see here was taken, broken, and then returned, found later in pieces. So these are ancient Iraqi and Iranian artifacts that have been stolen, and people want them returned. The Mona Lisa. Do you think that she was made in France, where she lives now? No, she's an Italian artwork. But at some point in her life, she was taken to France, and she lives there now. And they're not going to give her back to Italy, even though she's Italian, right? She makes them a lot of money. Here you have the Egyptian Museum in Turin in Italy, an Italian museum full of one of the biggest collections of Egyptian art. Well, should those be in Italy so everyone can see them in Italy, or should they be in Egypt where people can go to Egypt and see them? It goes on and on. Nazis stole a lot of works, during World War II. Here you see Nazi soldiers posing with paintings that they stole from the National Museum of Naples. So this goes on, and this is the one you're going to look more at in the assignment that's happening later in the semester. The assignment that's looking at restitution, where here you have the British punitive expedition basically raided the Benin Palace in Africa, took all these treasures and took them all back to London in the 1800s, and basically they're still there. And the African country of Benin would love their objects back. So this leads to lots of questions, ethical questions, right? Who belongs, or where do these objects belong? How does it become messy over time? And you know, who can have them and who should protect them and who should see them. So that would be something for you to deal with at a later time. I want to quit this lecture to make it nice and short for you, but I hope you enjoyed. Let me know if you have other questions about ancient art, and we'll talk soon.